Welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. Hopefully you can hear me. If not, let me know. I'll be your host, Jared, and if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or if you need to clarify them, you can come off mute and ask them. All right. We got one right here. All right, Radley, go right ahead. You got power to talk.
Hey, Jared. So when you're configuring a flow and you configure a user interface to be able to have that flow started via a link.
Mm-hmm.
That link has all the parameters in it, right? The name session user, the flow ID, all that. Is there a way to have a redirect where you could configure a friendly URL and then have it go to that parameterized URL?
Good question. I know what you can do. See if I can show this real quick, as I know you can develop a custom. Let me do this one. Test the flow. And I believe over here, user interface. Oh, can you not? I don't, because I know you can API. Because I know you can override the service URL with the API. And I thought you could do that with the user interface, but it looks like you can't. So let's do user interface. And so you want a friendly URL. So I'm not sure if there's a decisions alias you can make. Let me first test that. Let me use this because I know we have integrations on folders. Integration, view integration details. All that stuff. It's like the page, that's just display settings. That just changes the Chrome settings. So I don't think we do. I'm going to take this offline and I'll ask the support and let you know. Could you post your email address? Because if I do find out and it's after the call, I'll just email you.
Yep, I can do that.
Yeah, because that's a good question, I believe. So basically just making an alias, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Awesome. There you go.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Jared.
My pleasure. Anyone else? All right, cool. Well, I do have one pre-submitted question. And this specific user asked this question about validations on a form, and specifically how to do like character validations. So I'll go ahead and show that real quick and talk through how one would go about designing that. So let's see. Lunch and Learns question. Yes, so the question was, how do you limit characters in a string in a text box? So example, a string in an input text box must be 12 characters or X amount of characters, and it prevents the user from submitting it if it's more or less than that amount. Okay, so we can show both that way too. So essentially what you'll want to do is you want to and the first step is, let me go ahead, I'm gonna remove this. And if my mic cuts out, just type in the chat, let me know, and I have to do the very nerdy creative resolution of unplugging and replugging. So anyway, so let's say I have a form. I'm gonna create a tiny quick form. Let's say I need some validations on it. I want to remove this thing. Can I remove this one? I don't know where that form's at. Create a form. We're gonna use, this is the example. validation form. So anytime you need to create validations, the thing you must always think of is that, hey, I need to create a validation. I'm going to use an active form flow. Active form flows are the ways we create validations that came about in version 7 and and any future versions. We use active form flows. Now there are our legacy ways, right? If you click on, make sure you click on like the checkered space of the form canvas, and you go to your properties to the right, and you scroll down, you'll notice you have these things called form rules and active form flows where you can add. You will also have a legacy way. And you may ask, what are these things? The legacy way was how we configured data flow manipulation on a form level, validations on a form level, and it was all done through these legacy ways. We don't recommend people use these. They're only there in the event a customer was on version 6 or 5, and then they decide to upgrade to 7 or higher. And so to have backwards compatibility, we have this here, but we advise users to just use active form flows whenever they're designing these validations. All right, so that's the first thing, is you need to use an active form flow. All right, so now let's talk specifically about how would you make that validation? So first thing you want to do is when you make a validation, I'm going to say this is my input string box right here, and I'm actually going to call and name this control input string. The reason why I do this, and you'll be able to see this when I demonstrate actually building it in an active form flow, is any control that you have on your form, meaning like text box, buttons, labels, all that stuff, whatever you name this control. So I'm actually going to use my handy dandy nifty annotation tool. Anything you name right here will be the data name of your form control in the active form flow designer. So I'm going to say that one more time. Any control name that you name on your form will be the data name on the active form flow designer. So let's say if I rename this, right now, both of, I'm practicing consistent naming, so I'm naming them both the same thing. But let's say I named this my, let's say this is the, I don't know, password, right? I want people to put in a password for somewhere. So this is my password name. Now, what you'll see here is this password, look back this one, this password name will be the data name of this control in the active form flow. Now, if I'm in a normal flow, like just a default flow behavior, the data name will be input string, but we're talking about utilizing the active form flow. So let's call this, we'll just say this is like, or I'll say this is like string length restriction to make it really noticeable. All right, awesome. So we got string length restriction. All right, so I have this text box. I need to filter this. And let's say I want that only text that are 12 characters. It has to be 12 characters will be allowed in here. So then that means what I need to do is I need to create an active form flow. Left click the checkered box, and then you click on the active form flows, and then that preloads an active form flow, and whatever you name it here will be the name of it. Now, it's important to understand when you create an active form flow, you have to tell the form what is going to trigger this. So if I left click on any of the controls, see everything you see here is a type of form control. It'll tell you if it's a text box, a number box by a little graph to the right here. And then when you left click it, you'll have all of the ways that a user who interacts with that form control can trigger that specific flow. So what that means is I need to make sure that I want this flow to be triggered when the user does what? Well, I want value change, right? Because if a user types in 10 characters and it's supposed to be 12, well, I want them to be able to add the correct character amount, and then I need the flow to run again once the user has corrected that. So that's why we're going to use value change in this circumstance. Maybe in other ones, you won't use value change, you'll use a different one. But in this context, we use value change. Then if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you have a bunch of these options here. What do these things mean? Auto run just means that it continues to run. Make output data as forms output data. It says any output data you configure on that active form flow will be shown as an output of the form step in a flow. Run on all outcomes means that it will run all of the validations that are in this active form flow and prevent the users from proceeding away from the form if an errored validation is triggered. So if you want to stop a user from progressing the form after you configured a validation, you must make sure you configure this that says on every single button, right? I only have one button, what is it? Button. But if I had several buttons, right? Let's say I had button 1 and then button 2, right? So I have 3 buttons. Now when I go into the active form flow, what you'll notice here is now I can have 3 buttons that I can choose from. So only when a user clicks on this button do I want the active form flow to stop that form from going down that path, right? So that's what that means. So in this context, I'm going to remove all these extra buttons because I don't need it. But I wanted to merely show you guys how the outcome buttons manifest themselves. All right, back to the active form flow. I want this to run on this action outcome button, so I'm just going to click on that. And then I'm going to call this text box length must be 12 characters. Nothing more or less, right? You can make this, just give it a name, right? Probably a long name is not the best, but I'm just going to have some fun here. All righty. And then I'm going to make sure I change this to value change. All right, cool. So now we're done. Now we need to actually configure this flow. And so remember what I said, that the string length restriction, the name of the control, is going to appear as the data name within the flow. You're actually going to get to see that right now. So I'm going to go into this active form flow. And what you'll see is when I go to the data explorer and I expand form data, you'll see now I have that form control name, string length restriction form control data. So that's why it's important to understand you have to rename your controls, because then when you interface and do things like validations or active form flows or any of the sort, those data names will appear as the name in the data explorer of that active form flow. And then when you create the logic to filter and do whatever you need to, it makes it a lot easier. Every time you want to check the value of a specific form control, you're always going to use this value property here. That's the part you're going to utilize to check if the string length's a certain way, to check if whatever the case is, right? So that's the value you have to evaluate. You don't want to do initial value. That's if you've preloaded the data with something from a flow before it. But in this circumstance, you're just going to use the value. Whatever the value is, we're going to evaluate. All right. So now we get to the germane question, right? How do we evaluate and create a validation for a string that has to be 12 characters? Well, not too hard. A couple of steps we're going to need. We're going to need the equal step, right? So we have equals number, perfect, boom. So it's got to equal a number. In this case, it's going to be 12. Then we have to configure some validations on it. The validation steps you're going to want to use is specifically only in active form flows, only in active form flows. There is a category called form rules. If you are in a flow and you're like, hey, I can't find my form rules. The reason why is because you're in a default, we call a default flow behavior. And so different flow behaviors will have different options and categories for flow steps. So what that means is you'll need to make sure that you are in the active form flow behavior or creating an active form flow inside the form. And then once you edit that flow, you'll have access to form rule. All right. So now what do we got to build? So now we need a couple of other steps, right? So we need to say, okay, if it's not equal to 12 on the false path, then what we're going to do is we're going to set a validation. So we're going to use a set validation step. And we'll talk about how to set this up in a little bit. And if we want to, after we set a validation, right, and let's say someone fixes it, right, we need to tell decisions to clear that validation. So we're going to say, hey, let's clear that validations. So we can use the clear validation step. There's a lot of different validation steps where you can say, hey, I want to clear a specific validation on a specific. Hey, I think I'm back. Ah, thanks. I think I'm good for now. Will, can you hear me? Am I audible? Type in the chat or something. Let me know. Perfect. Okay. Good, good. All right. So what I was saying was you want to think of, there's 3 types of clear validation steps. What are the differences? Before I was rudely interrupted by my microphone. How dare it? The first one is called clear all validations. What clear all validation does is it removes every validation on the form. So this could be validations on different form controls. It basically just says, hey, whatever validations appear in this form, regardless of what form control it is, clear it out. So that one you may want to use, you may not. It's probably too broad. The next one you're going to want to do is clear validations. So let's say you have a lot of validations on one form control. Well, this will clear all validations on the one form control, or just the one. So it gets one or many validations. But the difference between the all validations and the clear validations is the clear validations, right? You can see there's no input property for clear all validations. And the clear validation just says, hey, I'll clear every validation just on a specific form. So as you can see here, it's getting kind of more granular, right? And then the most granular of all 3 is clear particular validation, which says, hey, I'll clear a single validation or a single named validation if you pass in a list of it, and on a specific form control. So basically the one on the bottom, clear particular validations, gives you the most granularity if you have a lot of form validations. Clear validations will clear everything specific to just that form control, and then clear all validations will clear everything on the form, regardless of form control. All right, cool. I think we got the point there. I'm going to delete these. The one we're going to use for this context, because since I'm only going to have one validation, is the clear validations. But like I said, if you have multiple validations on that text box control, you can use just clear particular validations and then specify the one you want removed. All right, so we got that point. So let's connect this process up. Boom, there you go. So this is the base design pattern of the logic. So now we have to map in the data to it, right? We've already got the setup of it. It's pretty easy, not too complicated to understand. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we have to say if the value 1, which I'm going to select from flow here, and I'm going to say form data control, and then I'll grab the value. Now, I hope you noticed, or actually, I actually messed up something. Oops, forgot. So we're actually missing another step. So the ask here was we have to clear a particular, not clear a particular validation. We have to determine what the string length is of a specific piece of text and then compare if that is equal to 12. So there is a step in decisions called get string length. Boom. All right, so what does this step do? Well, it does just that. It outputs the number of how long a string is, and it will count the characters. So we need this step first because we need to say, hey, whatever that string is that the user typed in, we must count that. And then once we count that, we can output that data into the equals and then evaluate whether it's true or false or what have you. So what we're going to do is in here, we have to select from flow. And then we're going to go to form data. We're going to go to the string length restriction. Remember, that's the name of the form control I configured. And then I'm going to grab the value. So as you can see here, this beautifully trees out the direction of my path, right? So I went to form data. Then after form data, I went to the string length restriction, and then I went to the value property of that string length restriction. So that's how you read that. It goes down the tree. All right. So we got that part. So we configured this pretty good. We click done. If we click X, it removes the configuration we just made. So now what we can do is now I have an output of the string length. Now I can say, hey, I'm going to select from flow because I want to determine if the get string length output, because I pass it into that process in that step. So I got to reference the output of that step. I'm going to say, does the string length equal, which I'm going to be as a constant, to 12. All right, so that's what we're going to do. And then we configured the validations here. So clear validations is the easiest one because we just have to add the form control. So we'll do this one next. All you have to do is you have to click on the unknown text here on that form control, left say that 10 times fast. Select from flow. I'm going to say it differently. Choose select from flow. Once you choose select from flow, then what you can do is you can drill down to form data, and then you can grab the specific form control. Now notice I did not grab the value here. I did not grab the value because remember, this is looking for a form control data type. And so I've selected the form control data. So I can stop here. I don't need to drill down into any of these things for the validation. So that's a big point to remember. If you're trying to manipulate the data of the form control, then you go to the value. If you're just trying to clear things on the form control like validations, you always stop at the form control data and select the form. That's a very important point. I've seen many students will put in values and some random other properties here, and that's what you do not want to do that. You have to isolate. Validations are on the form control, so I will choose the form control only. Evaluating values of the form control, then I grab the value. So I just want to make sure that part was stressed. All right, cool. So we got that part. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click done. So now we have pretty much everything all configured. We're grabbing in the form control string length restriction value so we can count how many values are in it. We're sending this into a rule where we're going to evaluate if that output is equal to 12. If it is equal to 12, we're going to clear whatever validation that we have on it. Now we're going to go and talk about the circumstance if it's not 12. So if it's 13, if it's 11, if it's anything other than 12, what do we do? First things first, right? Form control. We're going to select the actual form control. We're not selecting the value. So we go to form data and we go to string length restriction, right? Just for review, we do not select any of the properties here. We only select the actual form control because that's what it's asking for. All right. So we got that. So right, this is, and notice these inputs are the exact same in this context, right? In another use case, there may be a different context, but in this context, both of these inputs are the exact same. So now what do we do here? Where do I get this list of validation issues? Well, you could do it one of two ways. Anytime you see like a strange composite type, this is just a good general like decisions development tip that I always reference, is if you want to know like what are the properties that make up the specific value, right? You want to utilize the constant, meaning that when I select constant, oops, that's not where I wanted. When I select constant, I can see what are the properties that make up validation issues. And so I'm going to go ahead and select a constant here. Now notice this is a list. So now I have the option to add an item to that list. So I'm going to go ahead and click add, boom, right here. And when I do that, you can see that a validation issue is made up of a break level and a message. That's the only two things it's made out of. So now I can say, hey, this break level is fatal, and I can type any message I want and say, hey, character length must be 12. Right, boom. Now it will have that as its message. Now let's say you may be in the circumstance where you want to dynamically determine that message. You don't want you just to select from flow or do a constant and everything's constant. Then in that scenario, what you want to do is you want to build the array on the validation issues. Then you want to build data on the validation issues. And then what you can do is you can select from flow and pass in the message, or you can set the break level to a constant, make it fatal, or you can send in the message dynamically. So I'm going to set this as a constant because that's all I need. So this will be character length must be 12. But I wanted to show you guys both ways. I didn't spell that right. Character length must be 12. So I wanted to show both ways because if you are in a circumstance where you need a dynamic like message, you can easily create that. Remember, you just have to build the array first, and then you build the data on the item 0. If you just want it all constant, you can set up a constant and do all that. So, alrighty, so now we got this. All right, so now we're configured here, right? So now we have this process done. Just like every process in decisions, you must always test to see if this works. You have to test to see if it works. You can't assume this thing works. But before we go to that, notice I didn't configure anything on the output data. a lot of students will always do this, or like output, like, oh, I got to output all this stuff. You never, ever, ever, ever need to do this. So just get in the habit of never outputting any data. Whenever you're using an active form flow, all you have to do is transform any of the data and refer back to any of the form data that's mapped here. You do not need to output anything here. So for example, if I wanted to change the value of the text value in my text box, all I have to do is edit the output mapping on that step, right? This is the edit the output mapping, not the end step. And then I can just drag, drill down into form data, drill down into string length restriction, and I can easily say, hey, change the value on that. I'm gonna set this back to rename so it doesn't have any issues. So that's what we mean by that. If we say you have to manipulate any of the output of the step, we never, in active form flow, we never ever add data to this step. All right, so make sure that's clear. All right, so the next thing we need to do, right? We have to test. Does this thing work? Right? Does it grow any corn? That's what we have to determine, right? Is this useful? So now what we're going to do is we're going to close and save this. And you'll notice that now you must make sure you do not, I repeat, don't click the X. Don't click the X. You have to click OK, because if you click the X, that active form flow will be removed and not attached to this form, and there's no way you can retrieve it. So you must make sure that you always click OK when you're done configuring an active form flow. Alrighty, so go ahead and click OK. Boom, now we got this active form flow, and now we need to determine if it works. Now, a temptation that most all students do is they'll go to preview and they'll start typing away. Right? And they're like, oh, my active form flow is junk. It doesn't work. This thing's, active form flows are dumb. They don't work. The problem here is the preview does not run any active form flow. So you have to be aware of that. Anytime you want to test your active form flow, you cannot use the preview, because the preview is just showing you like how the user interaction will be like when the user clicks on your form components. That's it. That's all it does. It's not meant for troubleshooting active form flows. So then that begs the question, how do you troubleshoot active form flows? How you troubleshoot active form flows, let me save this and not delete it, is you'll have to create a flow, and then you'll drag that form onto that flow. So show form, pick a create form, pick existing. I'm going to go to recent, and I'm going to grab, let's see, I think it's this one, example validation form. So I pick it, connect by button here. And then now, since I've configured this, I can go ahead and test it. You'll notice that I get a yellow triangle here. That just is, it's there because it's saying, hey, you haven't defined any input for the text box value. And like I said, I'm going to have the user define that when they type it in. So commonly you can leave this as ignore, or you can leave it as unknown. And what that will do is you'll just have a validation because decisions is not sure if you want that. So it's just bringing that to your attention like, hey, this may be an issue, but we don't know. All right, so I'm just going to leave this as ignore because I don't care. And I'm going to debug this. So let us debug and see what happens. All right, so I got this text box and my button. Now, to test this, now I type in control. So let's say my password was super secret and it was password, passrod or something. Right, and you'll notice, hey, I got the validation. Character length must be 12, and I think password is 8. So if I say password 1234 or 1224, notice that my validation went away. Because it counted the characters and said, hey, there it has 12 characters now. But remember, I had a couple of, right, when I did password, it threw the error. As you can see, I hope you're noticing something on the left part of my screen is I have rule flow. This rule flow is
Your mic went out.
What about now? Am I back?
You're back.
Thank you. Before I was rudely interrupted. Anyway, so let's say I want to test. I have to test this. How does this thing work? And you'll notice that I have this rule flow all the way here, right? And so what that means is I can minimize my form and still be in the debugger. And then what I can do is I can drill down into this rule flow And notice I have the different rule flow executions here. So I can look at the first one and say, okay, well, let's see what data went through. And I can look at the inputs and outputs of the step. So pass rod, because I can't spell, as you guys know, that's why I went to technology, because I got Microsoft Word or Google Docs or something, right? So pass rod, and it says the length is 8. That's accurate. I can count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And then when I go to my rule, I can look at the inputs and outputs and execution of this. Is 8 equal to 12? False. Okay, cool. Then I can look at the inputs and outputs of the set validation step. And you can see it outputs the message, character length must be 12. So now I can confirm, okay, that, that correctly went down the false path. Now I need to say, let's look at a situation where it runs down the true path. So that one's false, and I can see why, right? I can go into the inputs and outputs. Okay, it says 8 is false, but what was the data I passed in? Let's see, password. So I just fixed my spelling, right? And then I can go into the third one, which I think is the accurate one, where I can see that it cleared that validation because it identified that password 1224 is 12. And then we go to the rule, right clicking and left clicking on this icon, on this black arrow here. And I can see 12 is equal to 12, true, and it then goes down. And then this step, I don't think outputs anything. It just clears the list of validations. So that's how you troubleshoot your active form flows if they don't work, right? And then you can bring this form back up and you can say, hey, I want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll still get an error because it must be 12. And then you'll notice that if I have any more, I get this weird like load 5, 5 right here. So in that scenario, what I can do is I can then just left click that. I can get the extra execution, and then I can look at that, and then I can now compare that specific execution, inputs and outputs. So we got 10. All right, so let's go to this one because I think this one was it. Oh, where's my other one? All right, 10. And then if I look at the equals right here, and I can see that, hey, 10 is not 12, and it goes down the false path. So that's essentially how it works. And that's how you create a validation where you must have a character that is equal to 12. And then another thing to emphasize is, right, this works if I submit it because it's 12. I'm going to go back to the test flow where it's running. And you'll see that, hey, the form submitted. If I create a new session and run it, right? So I'm actually going to remove my doodles. And let's say I want to do password. And let's say we are that type of user where we're like, you know what? I don't care what this says. I want to submit it anyway. So then I click on the button. And you'll notice now the button does not let me submit because password is not fixed. If password is over, it won't let me because it just fixed, right? Now, but the reason why that works is because on my active form flow, I have set this active form flow to run on this outcome. If I didn't tell it to run on the outcome, watch what happens. I close this, save this, and then when I debug this, even though it's password and and we can clearly see it's not 12 characters, boom, I can submit it anyway. So that's the thing you want to be aware of. You have to make sure if you want any of your validations to stop people from sending in data through the process, you will have to make sure that this checkbox, run for outcomes or run for all outcomes, is set if you have multiple outcomes or certain validations that have to be run on every single outcome of the form action. Alrighty. Very long answer, but I wanted to answer it that way because it was just such a great question and such a good use case because validation of active form flows and running on different actionable outcomes is something that will always be used regardless of your project. So I wanted to answer it in that way that was very thorough, that talked through the specific pieces. All right, any comments or questions? Yeah, my pleasure. Now this will also be recorded too, Shane. So like you'll be able to review this. So it's not, you won't have to worry about missing anything. So if you need a refresher, you'll be back up. My pleasure. Does the clear all validation step only clear the ones in the active form flow? The clear all validations will clear every validation on the form. So it's not tied to the active form flow. It's whatever validations you have on that form, they're all going to be removed. So let's say I had another part, another control that was like, hey, someone can submit a date in the past, right? And if I say clear all validations, it's just going to clear every single validation. I think there's also a good active form flow document that I think Doc has written. Let me put that in the chat too, because that would be super helpful. Active form flows overview. Perfect. Oh, this is a great doc. Kudos to Will Clemens and the doc team. This will go, basically this goes over everything that I've just talked about and then some. So if you want to do even like really cool things, and I think in the validation overview right here, that's where you'll find the specific parts that I demonstrated. So I want to put this here. We're going to go to host and pin. Everyone gets this document. There you go. So that's a good one to bookmark and save. Documentation side is really good for explaining what these features do. My pleasure. Any other questions? All right, I don't see any questions, so I think I'm going to wrap it up so we can get that recording mixed for that demonstration. So just to close out, tomorrow you'll have Cameron Irby. He is on the support team. He'll be also a good asset to ask questions to. He's also really good if you have any know any people who are interested in learning about the HL7 one. You can ask him HL7 questions because he's utilized the HL7 module. Depending on what your company utilizes. So he'll be a great person to ask for that. And then next week, we'll resume Lunch and Learns and we'll have different panelists at that time. So, but appreciate you guys' attendance and we'll see you guys next time.